Thank you, the museum. Thank you very much for hosting this. And Anna, thank you for all of your hard work. And Savannah, thank you for everything that you've done, Savannah Berryman Moore. And MaryBeth, thank you for being here. And a few things before we get started. The one thing that I absolutely have to say is that the museum is amazing, but for my entire childhood, I rode my bike up and down Hines Point Road and saw this huge building on the top of the hill when it was I think it was a Veterans of Foreign War Hospital, and then it was the St. Pierre's camp. And so now to see it in this guise is fabulous. So congratulations to the museum. Okay, so MaryBeth, we're here to talk about and celebrate 1774, the long year of revolution. Just a few things about MaryBeth, since I now know everything about you. MaryBeth was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. David McCullough has called her work brilliant with a great gift for clear-eyed imaginative scholarship. And the hallmark of MaryBeth's work is, quote, insight, originality, and meticulous attention to detail, which I can vouch for. Her books have been called vivid, startling, landmark, social history on a grand scale, imaginatively conceived and massively researched. Her books are way ahead of their time and led to a new understanding of American history during the Revolution, showing how women's lives and the Revolution shaped one another. And this is MaryBeth's first book in 9 years. And as I say, I could go on and on, but I do want to say that MaryBeth is a pathfinder, and you don't get a chance to talk, MaryBeth. I'm going to say all of this about you, and then we'll get to the questions. You were the first woman to teach history at Cornell, in Cornell's history department. And you remained the only woman for 5 years, and then one of 2 women for another decade. Do we want to see how incredible that is? MaryBeth has received many awards, including the Rockefeller and Guggenheim Foundation, and you were the past 2018 president of the American Historical Association. In the company of such past presidents as George Bancroft, John Jay, Henry Adams, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Allen Nevins, John Hope Franklin, Bernard Bailyn, Eric Foner, and Laurel Ulrich. So now here's the question. What was your process of writing this book in relation to your previous books, particularly since it had been with you for so many decades?
Well, as I have said, as I say in the introduction, I got the idea for this book originally from working on my dissertation on the Loyalists, because I realized when I did that 1774 was the crucial year that divided the American population. And so when I started it, I started really with my insight from many years ago and thinking about what I had learned about the Loyalists and their change, or their, not change of heart, but everybody else's change of heart really, about loyalty to the empire. And I started looking at everything I could find. I mean, literally everything I could find, published and unpublished, that would tell me anything about what people were thinking politically, what the discourse was throughout the entire year of 1774, starting with the Boston Tea Party in 73.
So what would I find? Were you going to go on? I didn't want to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Okay. What was the moment at Harvard when James Otis, who was considered the most important American of the 1760s, trained lawyer and master of argument, who changed sides, and he was the one who came up with "No taxation without representation," his famous song. What was the moment when Otis reached out to you, and instead of your becoming a 19th century historian of 19th century American cultural history, following in the path of Bernard Bailyn, you decided to become a colonial historian?
Well, it all had to do with my first year in graduate school, and I was working on my graduate seminar paper on Massachusetts reactions to the Stamp Act. And I was sitting in my carrel in the Harvard Library reading pamphlets by Otis, and one of them especially spoke to me, and I don't even know why. I have looked at it since to try to understand why that one and all others spoke to me, because it wasn't one of his really famous pamphlets. He got involved in a major pamphlet war in 1765, 66. But anyway, it was as though he reached out to me over the years and said, pay attention to the 18th century. I'd never paid attention to it before. It was always something that you just had to get through before you got to the interesting stuff in the 19th century. So James Otis.
What was in the pamphlet? Remember?
I don't remember specifically. It was an argument against a loyalist or against a conservative opponent. I do remember the name of the pamphlet. It was a letter to a noble lord was the name of the pamphlet. It really wasn't addressed to a noble lord. It was addressed to other Americans, but it was all about his objections to conservative objections to what was going on with respect to opposition to the Stamp Act.
But why did you shift your focus from Otis to the Loyalists? I mean, he had switched. You both did a sort of reverse of one another.
Right. Well, why did I do it? Well, there was a dissertation on Otis that had not been published at that time, so I got a copy of it, the microfilm edition. This was in the mid '60s, and it was boring. And I thought, I don't want to do something that's boring. So when I went to talk to Bernard Balin about my potential dissertation topic, I thought, well, why don't I work on Otis's opponents, the guys that he had been fighting against? And that's the Hutchinsons and the Olivers, and their leadership of the colony of Massachusetts. And Balin said to me at that time, I know people who are working on them in the 1760s. Why don't you look at the same people later on after they've become Loyalists? And so that's why I ended up doing Loyalists, because I became extremely interested in them and in England. I have to say, I loved London the first time I was there, and it was delightful to have an opportunity to have to go to London to do research on my dissertation.
So what I was going to ask you is, how did your graduate work on Loyalists lead you to the documents of people's letters and to see the most important aspect of all research, which became the hallmark of your writing, which is a firsthand view of seeing lives, attitudes, opinions, debates in the moment and the context of their time, and not in historical hindsight?
It was mostly because for my dissertation was largely based on correspondence of Loyalists in exile in England, home to their families in America, or letters that they received, or letters that they exchanged among themselves in England. Some of it was on diary. Some of them kept diaries in London, but mostly it was correspondence. So I was really looking at what they wrote to each other and what their families wrote to them and what they wrote to their families. So from the very beginning of my historical career, my career as a historian, I've been really concerned about people's correspondence. And that started with the dissertation. For one thing, I should say people didn't publish Loyalist letters. So you had to look at them in unpublished form.
I know. And so that's what it was so amazing because I want to ask you a question related to that, but your dissertation, The British Americans, which led to your first book, The British Americans, the Loyalist Exiles in England. The dissertation won the Society of American Historians Allen Nevins Prize for the best written dissertation in American history. And the book established you as one of the leaders of the new generations of historians of the revolution. And talk about the path of, it was reading the letters of Loyalist women that you came to see a difference in women's lives from what had been told about them, which was that it was had been a sort of golden age for women before industrialization. So what was it that you saw in those letters written by the women that made clear there was another reality?
Well, the standard line that was out there in the scholarship in the 60s when I started doing my research was that women were fully integrated into the economy of their farms. That is, these are farm women, and that they knew everything about the economy of the farms. And it was only with industrialization that women began to be separated from the larger economy because their husbands would go off to work and they were left at home, that sort of thing. So, but I realized from reading their correspondence that they didn't know beans about the farm. They were writing their husbands to say, what do I do about X or Y? You know, and he would write back and say, well, consult this guy about the horses, or consult that guy about what to plant in the back 40, or so forth. So it became clear to me that this idea that somehow women in the pre-industrial economy knew everything about the businesses of the families was completely wrong. And that the only women, I might add, there were some women who did know that, but they were women who'd been widowed. And so they had to take it on by themselves.
Right, interesting. So you've been thinking about the notions in your book, the debates, meetings, arguments taking place among the Loyalists for all this time. And it was really only that you were carried along on this other path by the work of, Anne Douglas and Gerda Lerner and Barbara Welter and people like that took you away from this other subject. So what made you return to it?
Well, because it had been sitting there in the back of my mind all these years. And for a while, after I got deeply into women's history, I kept trying to promote the topic of paying attention to what was going on in the year 1774 to some of my graduate students, but none of them took me up on it. So it was just sitting there. Nobody had written it. I felt no one had written the book that I thought should be written. So I decided to set out to write it myself.
And so you basically were trying to give it away because you were meant to write it yourself.
Yes, I decided I was meant to write it myself after I couldn't give it away to other people. So, and I realized that when I actually had one student who kind of did something like it, but he did his own thing, which he needed to do. Students need to do their own thing. You don't assign topics to students. And right. I could never find a student to do it. So I thought, this topic has been there. It's not been written about in the way that I would write about it, so I'm going to write about it. And I might say that I've written about it now very differently than I would have written about it had I done it in the 1970s, which was when I had my initial idea.
Okay, well, do you want to talk about how you would have written about it?
Well, it's hard to cast my mind back, but I think I would have... I think it would, in those days, we were doing a lot of quantitative stuff. So I probably would have done more counting of, who the members of the committees were and things like that. And it also wouldn't have been as much a narrative volume as this is. I mean, this is really a narrative volume trying to cover the entire period of December 73 through April 75. Comprehensively, and I don't think I would have done it that way in the 70s as I look back.
Well, one thing that I do want to say about this book that, I didn't say in the copy, but, in rereading it again, I have to say that one of the fabulous things about this book that's so impressive is how you show true democracy in action. Because of all of these people who were involved in these arguments, these debates, these conversations where everybody's participating to come to where they don't know, but it's a process. And one of the things that this book does is that there's no voice of hindsight of what will happen. Right. It's written even-handedly. So what's happening, it's happening in real time.
I really tried to do it that way. What I really like readers of the book to do is to forget that they know how the story came out and just be taken along with the debates and the discussions as they were occurring throughout the year 1774 as Americans were trying to figure out what to do, and with frankly limited knowledge about what was going on in England. Just little squibs of information coming in. I mean, one of my complaints about other books about this period, it's not really a complaint because they do other things, but most of the books about this period switch the focus to England at some point. And so they have a chapter or two that tells you exactly what's going on in Parliament. Well, Americans didn't know what was going on in Parliament, and I wanted my readers not to know what was going on in Parliament. So I didn't tell them. I wanted the book
it's very
in America.
Exactly. And, one of the things that you do that most other books haven't done is that you write about all of the colonies. You don't just write about Massachusetts, but talk a little bit, because, you know, when you read this book, you have a totally different, which is of course the accomplishment of the book, you have a totally different understanding of what happened having to do with the East India Tea Company and the reverberations that just went on and on and on and on.
Right.
And so talk a little bit about how that affected the residents, not just in Boston, but, you know, throughout Charleston, Philadelphia, New York.
Well, of course, tea ships went to those other cities too, but the only cities that have really been studied in any detail, or the only city is really Boston. There is an article about Charleston and that's it. And I was astonished to discover, and after I taught the Revolution for 40 years, that that the tea ship was in Charleston at exactly the same time the tea ships were in Boston. And that the Charleston people were dealing with the problem of imported East India Company tea simultaneously with the Bostonians and dealing with it very differently, with a very different outcome. So that was fascinating to me. And they didn't really know because of the difficulties of communication up and down the coast. The people in Charleston and the people in Boston, they knew vaguely that a ship had arrived in the other places, but they didn't really know what was going on. So that's why I did the first chapter the way I do, which is going back and forth in the narrative chronologically, almost week by week, talking about what's happening in the different cities. But yeah, the tea is important, and it remains important throughout the entire year, which is something that, again, you don't realize. You only think,
Exactly.
it's thrown into the harbor and that's it. But no, tea kept coming. For one thing, it wasn't until late January that the news got to England about what had happened in mid-December in Boston. And before that, other people were shipping tea. So the tea then arrived, and the people who had shipped it had no idea what was going to happen to it because they thought it was just like any other tea shipments. And then in America, people dealt with the tea in different ways. Sometimes they threw it overboard, sometimes they confiscated it, sometimes they shipped it to Nova Scotia. I mean, different things happened to the tea that came later. And the other thing,
but of course, at the heart of it, which, you know, you would think this, but, you know, you don't stop to sort of pay attention to this, was how important tea was, because even though these people were colonists, tea was essential to them. It was a way of life.
Yeah, tea, they were prodigious tea drinkers, and they mostly drank smuggled tea, which was what the problem of the East India Company was, because people were not paying the higher price for taxed East India Company tea. They were buying smuggled tea, which was cheaper. And there was a big argument, what was the better tea? Some people said that smuggled tea was better, but most people liked it better because it was cheaper. So the whole idea of the East India Company tea was to, or the whole idea of the Tea Act was to make the East India Company tea more affordable. It didn't work.
So at the heart of this was something called the Constitutional Catechism.
Yes.
Which was printed in early December 1773. It appeared in 2 local newspapers and then appeared in other colonies. And it said, why do the Americans refuse the importation of English tea at this time? Because it is saddled with a duty, which is a tax for the purpose of raising a revenue from us without our own consent, and such tax or duty is therefore unconstitutional, cruel, and unjust. Right. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, because it was so important?
Well, I think it was. I mean, nobody else has ever written about that before, but it got picked up in newspapers all the way through the colonies, and obviously it meant something to people. Otherwise, the newspaper editors would not have picked it up. And it laid out very clearly the argument about why you wouldn't buy tea or why you shouldn't buy tea. I mean, there were people who said, well, it's not really, the tea duty is not really a tax, because if we don't drink tea, we're not paying it. So it's up to us. It's our choice to pay the tax if we're drinking the tea. That was one of the arguments that was made against the argument in the Constitutional Catechism. But most people really seem to have bought the idea that the tea duty was a tax, and because it was without representation, which meant by that, what they meant by that was not, we want representation in Parliament. That's not what they meant. They meant we should only be taxed by our own legislative bodies. And that was
by their own consent.
Their own consent, by their own assemblies. Now, as we know, not everybody voted for those assemblies, but it was still, if it wasn't you, it was your neighbor who was voting for the assembly. And so, in fact, the issue of consent became really crucial. Even people who were loyalists by the end of 1774 kept saying Parliament should not tax us. I mean, they didn't want to leave the empire, but they said Parliament should not have the right to tax us. So it pretty much became a uniform argument, uniform opinion.
What did they mean when they said it was cruel because it treated Americans like enemies?
They meant that they were being treated worse than people living in Britain. They were comparing their situations to people in the home island. And they said, because in Britain, at least, you could, even if you too didn't have a vote, you or yourself didn't have a vote for a member of Parliament, there was a member of Parliament nominally representing your district. So you had an option to communicate with that person. But it was basically impossible to communicate from America to England to any member of Parliament.
Well, the Catechism went on to say, is it not incumbent upon us to defend our common property from all such implications? And you write about how that affected Boston, Charleston, all the cities up and down. So talk a little bit about how it did affect them.
Well, in Charleston, they couldn't make up their mind what to do. They really wanted the tea ship to go home, to go back to England, but they couldn't do that, or they felt they couldn't get the tea ship to leave the harbor properly, and so they ended up colluding with the customs officers in confiscating the tea. So in Charleston, the tea gets confiscated and put on shore, and eventually it's sold for the years later. It's sold to support the revolution. In Philadelphia and New York, they avoid the problem by refusing to let the tea ship enter the harbor in the first place. And they just churn it away before it even enters the harbor. So that avoids the issue of what do you do with the tea, because you just don't let it land. And that was actually an idea of Benjamin Rush's. Benjamin Rush, of course, became a later important revolutionary, and he basically was one of the pamphleteers, or he wrote a newspaper essay against the tea before it even arrived, saying what we have to do with this tea is not let it land. And he was right, because if it landed, people would buy it. And that was shown when one of the ships wrecked on the Cape, and everybody wanted to buy the tea that was wrecked on the Cape. So.
Well, you know, what's interesting though is how this tea just reverberated through the entire year. I mean, all the effects of it was central.
They continue to argue about whether the East India Company should be reimbursed for the tea throughout the entire year until the First Continental Congress, when the First Continental Congress votes that the East India Company should not be reimbursed. And alas, we do not know the content of that debate, but we do know it lasted most of one day, but nobody wrote about the contents of it. There were no minutes kept of the Continental Congress. Well, in some cases, we have people who wrote letters where they described debates, or in diary entries or notes that they wrote about debates. But this, we don't know. But we do know that in the October of '74, the Americans finally decided they would not pay for the tea. But it went on the whole time.
Is the way you found this, though, through reading articles or pamphlets of the time? I mean, it's not as if anybody had written about this before.
No, nobody's written about it. Yeah, nobody's written about how long the tea issue kept going. In fact, they've kind of suppressed it. I was astonished to discover how much conversation there was continuing about tea, because it's not normally, you don't normally see it. I mean, just to give you one brief example, George Washington, when he found out about the Boston Port Act, which was Britain's retaliation against Britain for destroying the tea, that is closing the port of Boston until the tea was paid for. When he found out about that, he said, and this is often quoted, "The cause of Boston is the cause of all America." And then people stop the quote. But if you continue, the sentence continues, parentheses, "not that we approve of their destruction of the tea." And so there was actually a big debate in the colonies as to whether Boston was right to destroy the tea. And in fact, most people seem to have thought, like George Washington, that it was not a good idea to destroy the tea. This is not the way the story has come down to us at all.
No, because it's been reduced to, okay, they threw the tea overboard and then on to the next.
Right.
When it was debated, I mean, the debate that went on during this long year of revolution was at the heart about the tea and what the tea represented.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
So you write about the Reverend Israel Holley of Suffield, Connecticut, and his sermon on Kings 12:15, where this is important. So the sermon was given 11 days after the disguised Mohawks destroyed the tea in Boston Harbor. And so did you come up, first of all, talk about what that was, the point of that sermon and how it was important and how it reverberated in the congregations in Boston and beyond?
Well, one of the things that's interesting is that it's the only sermon that I discovered, only pamphlet really that I discovered that was given in the immediate wake of the Boston Tea Party. And it's clear from the contents of the sermon that he is very conflicted about whether it was a good idea to destroy the tea, whether Boston was right or wrong, and that his congregation is very conflicted about it. Because they are interesting in not only this sermon, but other sermons. I discovered that by the time ministers published them, which was often weeks, if not a month or two after they gave the sermon, they add footnotes. And it's clear that what they're doing is they're responding to complaints from their congregation about the contents of the sermon. Like one guy later on in Boston has a sermon where he publishes a very political statement, and then he has a footnote that says, "And I think it's all right for ministers to make these kinds of political statements." And it's clear he only said that because somebody in his congregation came up to him and said, "This is not a good idea. You shouldn't be talking about this." So I thought it was fascinating to read these pamphlets. I might say I read every political pamphlet published in America by an American author, and in some cases by English authors, between the fall of '73 and April '75, every one.
Well, where did you find them all?
They were all over the place. I read a lot of them at the Huntington Library. I went out there to look at the originals, and it was very useful to see the original pamphlets because I could see the Huntington Library has multiple copies of some of these pamphlets. So I could compare printings. I could see that there were different printings. Sometimes there was different pagination. Sometimes there was different, there were typos that were corrected. So I could see that pamphlets, we don't really have, knowledge of how many copies were published, but I could see that certain pamphlets had been reprinted and reprinted again. The paper would be different, things like that. So that was very interesting. I also read some of them online when I couldn't get the actual copies. They have been digitized, but it was very, very useful to read the original copies. Even though what I was really looking for was marginalia, I was hoping I would find somebody who put comments in a margin on something. Nothing. These guys did not write in their books. So that was annoying. But I learned a lot by just looking at the pamphlets. And I might add
but you discovered the original sources. I mean, you didn't discover them, but you put them to use.
Yeah, and I saw other copies of the pamphlets at the Boston Athenaeum. And that was interesting because the Boston Athenaeum ended up with some copies of pamphlets owned by George Washington, and some of them were Loyalist pamphlets. I mean, his signature was on the title page, so I know that George Washington owned Loyalist pamphlets.
What was the most exciting part of writing this book?
Well, seeing it all come together, really. Being able, because when I researched it, of course, I was seeing, for example, I would be in Virginia and I'd read the letters of Virginians over a period of months. And then in Boston, I would read the letters of Bostonians over a period of months and so forth. But when I took the notes, I took them with always knowing what the date was. And so seeing how, when I put all the notes together chronologically to see how the things fit together, how people were communicating with each other or not communicating with each other over these colonial lines, whether they knew what was happening or not. It was like a giant picture puzzle, and seeing it fit together, because of course I couldn't research it chronologically, but I wrote it I literally wrote it chronologically, as you know, because you read the chapters as I was writing them.
But when you started out, you didn't have a notion of what you had. You had an instinct, you had an idea, but you didn't know that it was what you were going to find.
I did not know what I was going to find. That's right. I did not know what I was going to find. For example, one of the things I did not know I was going to find was when I looked really carefully at all the records of the individual county meetings that were held in Virginia over the summer of 1774, and the specific resolutions that came out of each county. If I remember correctly, there are 28 counties that have resolutions. I think the number is 28. I looked really carefully at those resolutions. There's only one county that specifically copies another county's resolutions. So even though the thrust of these county meetings was the same, they were clearly operating independently and operating, without copy. They didn't have another text in front of them. They were not just copying what somebody else wrote. So I thought I was seeing grassroots. I couldn't really see beyond the resolutions because there are no minutes kept of those meetings. But what I saw was back to tea. So many of them just retained a discreet silence on the issue of whether it was a good idea for Boston to destroy the tea or not. There was only one county in Virginia that said, "Yay, Boston, you did the right thing." There was another county in Virginia that said, "Boo, Boston, you did absolutely the wrong thing." And then everybody else either waffled or stayed silent. And I thought that was really, really interesting, because it just showed once again that what Bostonians did was not necessarily what other people thought they should be doing. Even though they were all supporting Boston with the boycott that the British had done with the Port Act and so forth, but nevertheless they didn't approve of what Boston had done.
But did they not approve of what Boston had done at the moment that the British were demanding that they turn against Boston, or was that before?
Well, the British didn't really demand that they turn against Boston. The British just sort of didn't want them to help Boston. I mean, it wasn't so much as turning against Boston as it was.
Well, they tried to divide them. They tried to divide the colonies.
They tried to divide the colonies, but that didn't work. I mean, I think the Bostonians very much got the support, the sympathy of other colonies. That is, they sent money to help besiege Boston with food. They sent even flocks of sheep were driven up from Connecticut and so forth so that they could slaughter them to feed the poor. But of course, even that became controversial because the Bostonians were criticized for misusing the help that they'd been sent by other people. I mean, it was fascinating to see the problems that the Bostonians got into over managing these resources that were sent to them by other colonies. I had never seen that in any other book.
There's just an interesting question from Heather Seeger. It says, in your research, did you find any evidence that Native Americans were either in support of or against the revolution?
In this research, not particularly, because this is really before the revolution in effect. I mean, it's before fighting. When in fact fighting begins, then I'll take that back. One of the things the Continental Congress does is it writes to Native American tribes and it says, stay out of this. This is a quarrel between us and England. We don't want you involved. Eventually, the British get a number of the tribes enlisted on their side. That's later on during the war itself. During this period,
Right. That is
there was
later on.
very little discussion of Native Americans in general. Very little discussions. There was the only colony in which I saw a discussion of Native American positions was in Georgia, where people were concerned about the Creeks. And so there was a debate in Georgia about, should we break with the British because we really need the British Army to support us if the Creeks attack us. But then other people said the British Army has never been there to support us before, so who cares? But Georgia did not send delegates to the First Continental Congress or the Second Continental Congress. It was the only colony that did not participate. So
when you were doing this research, the question just went out of my head. Well, tell me, what was the most difficult part of writing the book?
The most difficult part of writing the book. I don't know. I don't know that I would say that there was any part that was more difficult than any other. I did find it fascinating to really dig into research on certain things. And I don't know that I found entirely comprehensive answers about certain questions. For example, James Rivington, the Loyalist printer in New York, became a target of great opprobrium by the revolutionaries. And they all said that his pamphlets had a great reach. I got some examples of that, but I would have loved to have been able to find more. But it's very hard to find stuff out about Loyalists, even printers. Just really hard. His press was eventually burned, and he was basically run out of the colonies. He came back during the British occupation of New York, but some of that material is just lost. I mean, there is material that's just plain old lost, regardless. Mm-hmm. And it would have been wonderful to have had actual minutes or greater discussions of what went on at the Continental Congress. We just don't know.
Well, that was one of the things I wanted to ask you. That was the question that went on my mind. When you were reading these minutes, before we get to the Continental Congress, when you were reading these minutes of these meetings, how detailed were they?
Minutes of what meetings?
Town meetings of when people were discussing.
Oh, very. Yeah, they really didn't have formal minutes. It all depended on whether somebody kept a record, and not an official record. The official records were always very short. And so I'm just basically reporting what was decided on in the votes. And so what you had to do was to look for letters or sometimes publications. In Boston, that happened. People who disagreed with the decisions of the Boston town meeting in June.
You mean, would they be pamphlets in disagreement?
Yes, there were sometimes pamphlets would say, this is what happened at this meeting and I did not agree with it, or I said X and the other people said Y. But all you have to go on is what that person says, because you don't have any other source. And so in the notes, I try to sort of triangulate. There's one pamphlet that tells you things about what went on in the Boston town meeting that nothing else tells you. But the way he describes it, it seems to me he conflated two different Boston town meetings because it happened at different times. And so in the note, I try to sort out that this thing may have been said at that meeting and this other thing may have been said at this other meeting, but if you believe him at all. But I do tend to think that when people wrote things and published them, they really had happened more or less that way, because somebody else could say, wait a minute, I was there too, and that didn't happen that way. And nobody did that sort of thing. Nobody said that sort of thing. So but for all the evidence that we have about this period and the coming of the revolution, there is a lot of stuff that we just don't know. We just don't know.
Was there Heather asked the question, can you talk about, were there discussions about not drinking tea?
Oh yes, there were many discussions about not drinking tea, and there were. I mean, it was very interesting because the reason that the argument was you can't drink any tea, even smuggled tea, because we can't know whether it was really smuggled or not. It might be secretly from the East India Company, and so you can't drink any tea. Even though it seems kind of weird that you can't drink smuggled tea. But we know people were drinking tea, even though there was all this argument that you shouldn't drink tea. A lot of people, even there might be public tea burnings or things like that, but people clearly had a lot of tea stashed in their larders and they were continuing to drink it. And there are memoirs that are written later by women who say, yes, well, we had tea, but we drank it secretly in the basement so nobody could see. But there were lots of things in the newspapers about, why you shouldn't drink.
It was called the tea prohibition.
Yes, tea. Yes, exactly. You shouldn't drink tea, but because tea is bad for you. I mean, I think there are these hilarious, to us, comments by men claiming to be doctors, and a couple of them were saying that tea was bad for you, especially bad for women, because it would make you sick and it would make your children sick, and they would die a martyr to your ill-judged diet, is what one of them said. So yeah, it was very, drinking tea became very fraught at this time, but people still did it. But they did, funnily, there's a funny diary of a guy in Western Massachusetts who gets invited to drink tea at somebody else's house, and he's told that it's a local herbal tea. Then he realizes that it's actually very fine green tea that's been imported by the East India Company. So,
Talk a little bit about the Port Act of Spring '74. You mentioned it, you quoted Washington before saying the cause of Boston now isn't, ever will be considered the cause of America. But there were town meetings about that act. Again, this is why it makes perfect sense that you wrote about all of the colonies, because, from Providence, Gloucester, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Philadelphia, Baltimore, all the way down to Savannah, they were talking about this.
Right. Well, they all thought it was terrible that what Britain had done was to close the port of Boston. But they still did not defend the Bostonians and their destruction of the tea, for the most part. They really didn't do that. So, but it did help. I think the message of this book, in a lot of ways, is that the British were so heavy-handed in the way they dealt with the growing unrest in the colonies of various places and of various sorts, that they really got the colonies to unite in a way they probably wouldn't have otherwise. The British made lots of missteps. And one of the things that was interesting to me was that there were people in the colonies who were trying to write to them to tell them not to make these mistakes, but the British continued to make the mistakes.
Right, and then later they do have, the colonies get together and have a colonies-wide, I don't know whether they do it or they request, they are putting forth a colonies-wide boycott of all trade with Great Britain.
Yes, right. That's of course what comes out of the First Continental Congress, because they believe that that they can exert economic pressure on Britain, and that to do that, just stop buying British stuff, not just tea, but other things too.
Right.
And the whole idea there is you pressure the merchants, who will then pressure Parliament. That's the idea. You can't pressure Parliament directly, but if you pressure the merchants who are sending goods to America, then you get them on your side, and then they will pressure Parliament. It didn't work that way. It didn't happen. So it really didn't work, but that's what the Americans thought they were going to do. But yeah, so they set up, what's very interesting, of course, is that they set up this system of committees to enforce the boycott. And then those committees basically turn into local governments. They turn into local governments. I mean, they're supposed to be just enforcing the boycott, but they end up doing all kinds of other stuff too. They end up checking.
I mean, did you see that in your research?
I'm sorry, what?
MaryBeth, did you see that did you see that as you were researching? I mean, did you see that literally happening?
Oh yeah, you can see it happening that as they expand what they're doing. And they don't just try to stop merchants from boycotting goods. They try to stop merchants from talking bad about what the Americans are doing, or they try to stop people from doing other things. Well, the Continental Congress actually asks also for austerity measures. You know, there shouldn't be any gambling. There shouldn't be any horse racing. There shouldn't be any people handing out lavish gifts at funerals, which is one of the things that the 18th century people did. So all these measures of the Continental Congress got the committees got their fingers into all aspects of colonial economy, and actually into thought control in a lot of ways. I mean, there were people who had, for example, there were people who'd written letters home to Scotland saying this awful thing is happening now. The letter gets published in Scotland. It comes back to the colonies, and the poor guy who wrote it gets called up before the local committee and said, you said these horrible things. And this happened to a school teacher in Westmoreland County, Virginia. And he basically goes down on his knees and says, please, 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 guys, don't throw me out. I love being here, you know, that sort of thing. So there was censorship, very literal censorship of ideas, of contrary ideas.
And they just didn't want, well, they didn't want it, you know, criticisms of the colonies to be written. Was that it?
That's it. Yes, they did not. Right. They did not. And so they tried to suppress the Loyalist press in New York. It was basically in New York, the Loyalist press. There was also a Loyalist printer in Philadelphia, but the most important Loyalist presses, not just Rivington's, were in New York. So they were publicly burning.
One thing that I thought, yeah. If we had more time, I think it's fascinating that these people who sort of, in whatever way, ascended to some kind of power within the community began to exert control over the colonists in a way that they were trying to escape from. And here were these people who were doing the same thing.
And that's, of course, exactly the Loyalist argument you have there, Vicki. You know, that how can you let these unelected people in your neighborhood control what you're eating, what you're drinking, what your wife and daughter are wearing, that sort of thing. That was one of the major arguments, one of the major Loyalist pamphleteers.
You know, a few things. One is I've got many, many more questions, but before I won't have time for them all. I have two questions here. One is from Mark Lenahan. In your research, did you get a sense of how much of a role Black Americans played in 1774 politics, correspondence, and actions?
Well, there was, the issue of slavery did come up. It was not central in 1774. As far as correspondence is concerned, I didn't find people writing about Black Americans, or because most Black Americans were illiterate at the time, I didn't find any letters from them. But there were occasional times when pamphleteers did write about slavery. And one of the most important was a sermon given in Boston in 1774. A minister named Allen, who argued that all of Americans' problems were the result of holding slaves. And he argued that God hated America because, and was punishing America because it held slaves, and everyone should free their slaves. That's what he argued. So, but that's about as far as it
Well, Otis also wrote against, Otis also wrote against slavery.
Yes, and that was in 1765, because of course.
I'm sorry?
That's in 1765. So
right. Okay.
About 1774.
Yeah.
So, but no,
okay.
They're not. There is, toward the end of the year of 1774, there are some rumors of potential revolts of slaves that begin to be talked up, and I do mention that. But it doesn't seem to really enter into people's consciousness very much. later on, definitely, there's no question that the presence of enslaved people makes a difference for Americans after the war starts. But before the war starts, it's just simply not there.
Okay, Laura Noonan has a question, which is, what penalties of death were there for Loyalists? Were there colonists, that sort of local power?
Well, mostly what people did to Loyalists was to ostracize them. What you wanted to do to them was to get them out of there so they could not be influential. Certainly in my dissertation, I found that there was a real effort to exile Loyalists, to get them away from the community, not necessarily to kill them. There were very few, in the end, there were a few Loyalists who were hanged in the colonies. That was well into the war. Nothing like that happened in this period. There's a wonderful book by my friend Virginia Anderson called The Martyr and the Traitor, which is about a Loyalist who is hanged in Connecticut and compares his case to Nathan Hale's, because there's very similar timing. And they're both from Connecticut and both from similar backgrounds.
You know, you write about this, which I thought was fascinating, which is, you know, the sort of evolution of in the language of the word unconstitutional.
Yeah, right.
Which you talk about how it was, you know, came about from British press, but with the Stamp Act of 1765 and the Townshend Acts of 1768 to 1770, they started to use that word. And, you know, it's interesting. Talk a little bit about that, because it's—
Yeah, sure. It was really
before the revolution.
Yeah, it was really striking to me how the word unconstitutional gets used as a weapon, actually by both sides, in 1774. And it's a new word. It's not there in American usage. Well, it's there sort of in 65 and 67 and 70, but it's really not a common word in America. In fact, I even found one newspaper article, which I quote from, saying, "What does this word mean? I've never seen it before." So basically, what they meant by unconstitutional was something that was opposed to the standard practice of the government. And so the revolutionaries used it by saying, to say that what the British were doing was opposed to the standard practice of government because of what they were doing by taxing without representation. The Loyalists and the British used it by saying, what you're doing is unconstitutional because you're setting up all these governmental bodies that have no basis in the colonial charters. You're setting up committees, you're setting up provincial congresses, you're doing things like that. So both sides were using the term unconstitutional as a weapon and saying what the other people were doing was unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's not a constitution in the way we understand it, because it's not a written document, but it's constitution as the way they understand, right, which if you look it up in the OED is the way it was used in the 18th century, is the regular system of government.
So who are the historians and writers who have influenced you the most, and why?
Oh, goodness. Of course, my mentor, my late mentor, Bernard Balin, has been an enormous influence on me all my career. And my dear friend Pauline Mayer, who last died in 2013. And we were very good friends in graduate school, and we had once planned to write a book together about the revolution, and never got around to it. But she was one of the influences on the way I set this book up, because her marvelous book, which won a prize, which is the book on ratification, the book on the ratification of the Constitution, not the Constitutional Convention, but the ratification conventions in all the states. She wrote that as though she didn't know how the story came out. And that showed me how important it was to write my book as though I didn't know how the story came out. So that was really a model for me when I wrote this.
And, in listening to this, I mean, as somebody who's done research for a book, I don't think there's anything more exciting when you're doing research and you're following your instinct and something bears out in ways that you didn't even know
Right.
or imagine. So how did the book make you feel about the time leading up to the revolution and in relation to other aspects of your other books?
Well, it did. Well, for one thing, it confirmed the instinct I had all those years ago about the significance of 1774, but I had no idea about the details, obviously, from my original work on the Loyalists.
Right.
I had no idea about the details and how it played out, for example, in Philadelphia or New York. And all the arguments. I mean, New York was incredibly contentious throughout this period. So I learned a lot about New York politics, local New York politics, while working on this book, and it was fascinating. So I think basically I just learned how important it is. I'm sorry to say this in Massachusetts, but it's important to get away from just looking at Massachusetts when you're thinking about the revolution or the coming of the revolution.
So look, I just want to thank you. We're actually out of time, and I want to thank you, MaryBeth, for answering these questions and participating in this conversation. And the museum again, Anna Barber, thank you again. Here's the book, please buy it. The long year of revolution begins in December of 73 with the Tea Act and goes to mid-April 1775, from the First Continental Congress to the battles of Lexington and Concord. And it's a really spectacular book. And it really shows you how democracy works. So buy the book and you'll have a great time, and you will discover a whole other world that is our world.
Thank you.
And thank you and good night.
Thank you, Vicki, and thank you for all the help you gave me as I was putting it together. And thank you, Anna.
It was my pleasure.
For hosting this. This has been great.
Thank you both. And again, second that. Buy the book. It's incredible. And MaryBeth, you are one of the most passionate and enthusiastic speakers and historians. You're a role model for all of us in the business. So thank you. Go to your local bookstore and buy this book if you haven't. If you're on island, MaryBeth, you are going to be doing some more speaking engagements. So follow her if you want to, which I highly recommend. Joining.
I will. Can I promote the next one? The immediate next one is next week for the Falmouth Museum, where I'm just going to be talking about the shipwreck on the Cape and what happened to the tea. So in detail, which I just mentioned it briefly here.
I was going to ask you a question about it, but I thought next time, and now you'll discuss it in Falmouth.
Right, I'll discuss it virtually in Falmouth, right.
Yes.
Right.
All right, thanks again. And I just want to say Mark Lenehan is saying he's clapping. Bravo all.
Yes, thank you, Mark.
Okay. So good night and good luck, as they say.
Yeah.